Chapter 2. The Fantasist. In early October 1951, Julius Evola was carried on a stretcher into Rome's Palace of Justice, where he would stand trial for promoting the restoration of the dissolved Fascist Party. He had been held in the Regina Coeli prison since April, and the trial, which would end with his exoneration, helped to secure his reputation as an intellectual pariah in post-war Italy. The courtroom was filled with young men, many of them war veterans, who looked to the paraplegic defendant as the leader of an intransigent Italian right. Although he had denied the legitimacy of the Italian state in writing, Evola was respectful of the court, whom he addressed while wearing his trademark monocle. In his statement of self-defense, Evola acknowledged his sympathies for Italian fascism, but reminded the court that he had never joined the Fascist Party and had written critically of its policies, at some danger to himself. Admitting that he had been an ideological accessory to anti-liberal movements, he testified that his involvement took place on a purely intellectual and doctrinal level. Evola struck a pose of philosophical detachment, explaining that he defended timeless principles that transcended any political regime. "I have defended and I still defend fascist ideas, not inasmuch as they are fascist," he stated, but in the measure that they revive ideas superior and anterior to fascism. Evola protested that his principles were those shared universally before the French Revolution, and that if his opinions were criminal, then Plato, Aristotle, and Dante should be seated next to him. Evola had been arrested along with 30 other conspirators, variously charged with promoting political sedition and terrorism. Among the evidence presented against him was a magazine essay published in 1950 entitled Guidelines. One of his first responses to the changed political realities in Europe, the manifesto argued for the founding of a radical right that could stand apart from the emerging liberal order. It called for a group animated by a legionary spirit that exemplified hierarchical and aristocratic values during a time of bourgeois decadence. Evola noted that the essay never endorsed violence or proposed the formation of a political party. It called instead for a spiritual revolution of a new elite that could prepare the ground for post-liberal regimes on the European continent. After a 2-month trial, the court declared Evola innocent. In a letter to Carl Schmitt shortly after the verdict, Evola seemed confident of his future in public life and boasted that the trial had provided free publicity in my favor. In fact, the trial was one of the last times Evola would leave his nearby apartment until his death in 1974, and he later lamented that it had permanently blackened his reputation. He had been paralyzed in March 1945 while going for a walk during an Allied bombing run in Vienna, where he was living under a false name after escaping police detention in Rome. Evola said he was following his rule to seek dangers as a tacit way of putting fate to the test. But even as an invalid, he could not avoid being linked to violent extremism. He continued to be regarded as the leading theorist of Italian neo-fascism, and his work would be associated with and sometimes cited by terrorist groups throughout Italy's years of lead, a period of 3 decades, ending only in the early 1980s, that saw a string of bombings by right-wing activists pursuing a strategy of tension in face of a perceived communist threat. A 1985 government report after a bombing in Bologna identified Evola as an inspiration and one of the gurus of the Italian extreme right. Painter, occultist, mountaineer, sexologist, and unreliable scholar of Eastern religions, Evola was one of the strangest intellectual figures of his century. He impressed Benito Mussolini, worried Heinrich Himmler, and fascinated Corneliu Codreanu. Umberto Eco mocked him, the future Pope Paul VI condemned him, and Steve Bannon named him as an influence. Over a publishing career of more than 50 years, Evola produced an astonishing stream of books and articles that never deviated from what he called the great political tradition of the European right. His vision was uniquely utopian. It was a utopianism of the extreme right, and one that pitilessly inverted the ideals of liberal modernity. Against a secular world of growing freedom and equality, he conjured a fantastic world of his own imagination, a sacred world of unchanging order and inequality, in which all authority was absolute and every activity was holy. Evola aspired to be the most right-wing thinker possible in the modern world. There was nobody to his right, he believed, nor could there be. Idealism and the absolute individual. Giulio Cesare Andrea Evola was born in Rome on May 19, 1898, to a Sicilian family with distant ties to nobility. He responded to the title Baron and adopted the name Julius to emphasize his spiritual connection to Roman antiquity. About his background, little is known. No biographer has undertaken the project, and Evola carefully hid the details of his personal life, which he regarded as irrelevant to his work. From his autobiography, we learn only what he had already revealed in previous writings, where he placed his early life in the context of a personal crisis following the First World War. Evola served in an artillery unit during the conflict, and the experience left him, like many of his generation, disoriented and open to new modes of thinking. When he first achieved public notice in his early 20s, it was for his artistic talents. As a painter, Evola was a leading figure of the Dadaist movement in Italy, his work enjoying exhibitions in Milan and Berlin. Some of his paintings, which he described as inner landscapes, can be viewed at major European museums even today. As a poet, Evola wrote in French, occasionally reading his poems in cabarets while accompanied by the music of Schoenberg, Bartók, and Satie. Evola never repented of his avant-garde phase and its attack on middle-class manners and culture. Yet it ended abruptly, he claimed, when the spiritual emptiness of modern life brought him to contemplate suicide. Evola's crisis was the most personally revealing moment in his life, and it inspired him to seek ideas that remained fundamental for his mature political work. In 1922, he underwent what he called a conversion, in which his desire to end his life was overcome by studying an early Buddhist text. Evola did not become a Buddhist, but he credited Theravada teachings with providing an illumination as to how he could remain in the world while not being compromised by it. He claimed that Buddhism, in its true form, is not a religion, and has nothing to do with an ethics of compassion and human equality. Buddhism is Roman and aristocratic because it enables one to transcend the needs and concerns of normal human beings. Those with the strength to develop self-mastery attain what he called the unconditioned, which is not an escape from this world, but a state of superiority over it. In a book he wrote to pay his debt to the Buddha, Evola explained that Buddhism taught him each individual must rely on himself and on his own exertions, just as a soldier who is lost must rely on himself alone to rejoin the marching army. For much of the next decade, Evola sought to make philosophical sense of his experience through a study of German idealism. He labored to explain himself in Theory of the Absolute Individual, 1927, and Phenomenology of the Absolute Individual, 1930, books that were his first and only attempts to win a mainstream scholarly audience. They targeted Giovanni Gentile, who was arguably the most influential idealist philosopher of the time, as well as the principal theorist of the young fascist movement in Italy. The books represented an unsuccessful bid for attention from both the university and the regime of Mussolini, whose March on Rome in 1922 had inaugurated its 20 years in power. Evola believed that idealism was the greatest of the Western philosophical systems, but that its failure, and hence the failure of all philosophy, revealed the need for radically different accounts of knowledge and political life. Idealism explained the human mind's relationship with reality by arguing that being is the product of thought, that what the intellect knows is, strictly speaking, its own cognitive activity. Evola was impressed by idealism's striving for intellectual self-sufficiency. The world can only be my world, he affirmed. But he argued that it left the deepest human problems unsolved. Its mistake was to leave the human mind passively withdrawn into itself, alienated from real life and concrete experience. It was not enough to make the absolute ego the ground of all experience, Evola wrote. The absolute individual must affirm himself as the ground of all meaning. Evola called his position magical idealism. What he meant was made clear in a 1927 essay, which announced that the purpose of philosophy is not to acquire theoretical knowledge at all. Its purpose is radical self-transformation. It is to transform a student into a self-directed rather than an other-directed person, into a being who can create and control their own reality rather than being conditioned by it. Evola's brand of idealism found few readers and fewer converts, and he soon realized he had failed in reconciling individual liberation with true freedom in the world. He believed that he found a more promising path, however, with the help of a friend, Arturo Regini, who recommended the writings of a French scholar named René Guénon. Guénon had experienced a personal crisis much like Evola's, and he shared Evola's growing interest in spiritualism and the occult. His work purported to explain, as idealism could not, what kind of society exemplified the inegalitarian values that Evola glimpsed in his conversion. It was a community in which human beings continued to live in the uninterrupted tranquility of sacred order, and in which uncertainty and disagreement find no place. Evola had located his lost army. Guénon called it the world of tradition, and its discovery was the most important intellectual event in Evola's life, taking him away from academic philosophy and into the politics of fascist Europe. The world of tradition. Evola remarked that encountering Guénon was like acquiring eyes and ears, enabling him to perceive what had previously been invisible and mute. He called Guénon his master, a title that obscured the intellectual distance between them, as well as Evola's greater originality as a thinker. Guénon was a convert to Islam who had moved from Paris to Cairo in 1930 in search of a more traditional society. Sometimes called the Descartes of esotericism, he was an influential exponent of traditionalism, a school of thought that sought to identify the higher principles shared by the world's great spiritual teachers. Guénon's books claim to reveal the primal tradition behind these traditions, whose single inner core he distinguished from its various outer expressions. Evola was less interested in Guénon's work in comparative religion than his understanding of modernity, which offered Evola a powerful explanation for his own spiritual anomie. In his 1927 book, The Crisis of the Modern World, Guénon argued that modernity marked the final stage of a millennia-long cycle of historical decline. Those in the West live in what Hinduism calls the Kali Yuga, a spiritual dark age in which knowledge of transcendence has been almost entirely lost. Evola now saw the modern world in a striking new way. It was the result of a fractured relationship with a transcendent realm of order, which had unleashed social chaos and uncertainty. He organized his thoughts in his most famous work, Revolt Against the Modern World, a book that has enjoyed a cult-like status for the radical right since its publication in 1934. Evola was raised in a Catholic family, and his diagnosis of contemporary life often sounded Christian. which it emphatically was not. The basic problem with modernity is desacralization, the collapse of spiritual meaning in daily life. Work, family, leisure, and citizenship are no longer saturated with spiritual importance, but are understood in functionally secular terms. Man, like never before, has lost every possibility of contact with metaphysical reality, Evola wrote, because materialism kills every possibility, deflects every intent, and paralyzes every attempt at aspiring to a higher form of life. Following Guénon, Evola traced the disorders of modernity to its loss of contact with tradition, which he interpreted in political terms. Astonishingly, he did not date the break to the Enlightenment, the Reformation, or the end of antiquity. No, the world has been slouching into spiritual poverty since the 8th century BC, when the world of tradition began to disappear, just as historical consciousness began to dawn. Revolt was an epic, deadly serious, and occasionally surreal attempt to summon this vanished world and unearth its hidden clues in later history. It spurned the conventions of historical scholarship entirely, claiming that tradition could be accessed only by way of myth, legend, and esoteric readings of pre-modern texts. It contained, for example, an appendix on Arthurian legends and the Holy Grail, to which Evola added reflections on alchemy, all of which he identified as sources of Hermetic knowledge. Evola's sources, however fantastic, were secondary to his primary purpose, which was to enchant readers with the magical world of human prehistory. Revolt contended that primordial societies all operated on the same principles. The truths of tradition are simple and few, varying only in expression. In a traditional culture, every aspect of human life, every social activity, role, and caste is dedicated to the service of a higher order. Indeed, they are ritual pathways into what Evola deceptively called transcendence. There is no person or office whose duties are not prescribed, and thus consecrated by its place in a hierarchy believed to be an earthly reflection of a celestial order. Evola claimed that this idea informed Norse poetry, Hindu scripture, Roman religion, Celtic legend, and Mesoamerican myth. All attest to a social order where human beings find their place and purpose living under sacred hierarchy. Evola contrasted his view with that of Spengler, whose work he translated into Italian. Spengler's flaw was that he lacked any understanding of metaphysics and transcendence, which led him to conclude that cultures were irreducibly different. Evola studied Spengler closely and agreed with the German's aristocratic sensibilities, but arrived at a different conclusion, arguing that there are timeless and universal principles that have provided the foundation for every traditional culture. The world of tradition differs from the world of modernity in fundamental respects. Because the man of tradition is preternaturally aware of a superior dimension of existence, he experiences nature, history, and society in altogether different ways. He follows what Evola called the doctrine of two natures. He values the absolute over the contingent, the invisible over the visible, the sacred over the profane, and being over becoming. Evola's doctrine was metaphysically simple. For the follower of tradition, the phenomenal realm of daily experience is supported, sustained, and animated by a higher spiritual realm. In the traditional world, Evola explained, nature was not thought about but lived, as though it were a great sacred animated body, the visible expression of the invisible. Evola possessed a command of ancient and modern philosophy, but he declined, at every opportunity, to offer a philosophical defense of his doctrine. The demon of dialectics cannot demonstrate truths that can be perceived only by an elect few who are disposed by nature to see them. But the doctrine treated as incontestably true, allowed Evola to make a fascinating interpretation of traditional life and its deepest purposes. Tradition endowed human pursuits with absolute meaning. It did so by transforming them into rights. Evola claimed to show how basic human activities, from eating and sex, commerce and games, to war and social intercourse, were elevated by tradition into something ritualistic, becoming activities whose very repetitiveness offered a glimpse of an unchanging eternal realm. He did not argue that tradition is religious, and he strongly denied, for reasons that will be made clear, that it corresponds to our notions of religious belief. Human beings must eat, mate, fight, die, play, and obey, and it was the purpose of tradition to turn these mortal necessities into holy occasions. Tradition thereby protected human beings, healing the gap between their understanding of the social world and its fearful complexity. Evola's profound suggestion was that tradition shelters human beings from the ravages of mortality, change, and contingency. It was his most humane insight and his most deeply felt problem. Human life is threatened by direct exposure to its own impermanence, and all societies are horrified by their own extinction. Tradition offers protection from the terror of time, creating islands of unchanging order in a sea of flux and decay. In a revealing phrase, Evola spoke of tradition as a force that consumes time and history. Tradition is therefore the triumph of order over chaos. Yet the triumph requires human effort, and without the active imposition of form, the matter of human life inevitably degenerates. At the heart of Evola's work was a defense of the sacrality of political authority. The hierarchy of nature will collapse, and the healing of time will fail, he maintained, if not guarded by transcendent authority. Evola looked into the past and saw what modernity, in its blindness and hubris, could no longer perceive. True power and authority always come from above, never from below. According to tradition, he imagined, every authority is fraudulent, every law unjust, every institution is vain and ephemeral, unless they are derived from above and oriented upward. True authority is therefore always absolute and beyond challenge. It does not rely on brute coercion or violence, however, nor does its legitimacy rest on popular consent. As an incursion from a realm beyond mere life, the traditional state possessed what Evola called anagogic power. It inspired obedience, rooted in a kind of awe, due to its ability to lead man from the lower order of reality to the higher. Revolt against the modern world invoked nearly every anti-modern trope. There was once harmony, but now there is disorder. There was once community, but now there is loneliness. There was once happiness, but now there is misery. Yet Evola warned against the fantasy of escaping modernity for an imagined golden age. His books were written not to comfort the lost soldiers of tradition, but to provide ideological guidance for those with a realistic view of future possibilities. His battle myth, which he refined over decades, was that the decadent conditions of modernity imposed new obligations on the invisible army of tradition. Guénon had instructed his disciples to retreat into spiritual inwardness in order to protect the superiority of the contemplative life over the active life. Evola broke with his master. The spiritual and social conditions that characterize the Kali Yuga decrease the effectiveness of purely intellectual, contemplative, and ritual paths, he contended. In this age of decadence, the only way open to those seeking the great liberation is one of action. Fascism, racism, and the crisis of democratic authority. In tradition, Evola discovered the vantage point from which the deceptive circle of modernity could be transcended and seen for what it truly is. He saw it as the antithesis of everything that gave human life meaning. Drawing from Nietzsche's parable about the death of God, he described it as a historical process developing over centuries by which life had been slowly drained of transcendent significance. That God is dead did not mean that human beings had ceased calling themselves believers or worshipping. It meant that the spiritual values which once sustained the entire social order had collapsed, leaving behind structures that are residues, empty shells, incapable of offering real support. For Evola, this crisis was not religious, and he did not mourn the death of a God he never believed in. The crisis of modernity was one of political authority. He identified its origin with liberalism, from which the evils of individualism, materialism, and egalitarianism inevitably followed. History is the battleground between form and matter, and its present belligerents are the defenders of tradition and the tribunes of liberalism. Evola set them in absolute opposition. If tradition defended the sacred, immaterial, and eternal, liberalism exalted the human, earthly, and mutable. If tradition ordered life from above, liberalism emancipated it from below. Evola rarely cited intellectual authorities, and he never named, let alone examined, major philosophers in the liberal tradition. But Evola understood something important about liberalism, arguing that it transformed human life through a radical moral appeal. Liberalism demanded that political authority and social inequalities require special justification. The philosophical differences between Locke, Rousseau, and Mazzini are unimportant, Evola implied, when compared to their shared suspicion of traditional authority. Liberalism submits social hierarchies to popular scrutiny, rather than shielding them from it. Its deepest principle is that authority flows from below to above, and that a ruler is legitimate only when ratified by the consent of the ruled. Evola was horrified by the anti-traditional character of liberalism, especially its desire to free individuals from relationships of command and obedience. Everything he revered, social castes, natural inequalities, and sacred privileges, was targeted by liberalism for reform or abolition. He regarded the founding of the Italian Republic in 1871 as a calamity, but saved his harshest criticisms for the United States. It was a place where anyone can be anyone he wants to be, and each person can presume to possess the potential of everyone else, he complained. Worst of all, the terms superior and inferior lose their meaning. Evola sharpened his critique of liberalism in the years leading up to the Second World War, during which he edited a series of right-wing magazines and newspapers, including the influential Il Regime Fascista. He argued that liberalism is false to human nature and blind to human experience. It conceives of human beings as individual bearers of rights, who can define and pursue for themselves an understanding of the good life. But the law of life is inequality, Evola argued, and most human beings are born to obey, not to rule. They find happiness and dignity in the comforting continuities of tradition, not in the unending debates of parliamentary democracy. Liberalism is perniciously disorienting. By encouraging people to think and act apart from the guidance of authority, it renders them unable to see the naturalness, goodness, and even beauty in long-standing customs and inequalities. Freedom can only exist when there are masters opposed to slaves, Evola protested, when there are proud leaders and followers that boldly and generously put their lives and destinies in their hands. Evola's writings showed the influence of Joseph de Maistre and Juan Donoso Cortés, reactionaries who also mourned the disruption of European social patterns by revolutionary ideals. But unlike them, Evola was not a Christian, and his criticisms owed more to Roman antiquity than to Roman Catholicism. He argued that a liberal political order is not only inhumane, it is an impossibility. It is impossible, that is, for liberal rulers to act consistently with their stated principles. All political authority rests on judgments and exercises of power that cannot be justified by liberal norms. Liberalism fantastically overestimates the human capacity to justify any authority, entertaining the delusion that people can follow laws they author, venerate customs they can change, and obey sovereigns they can depose. Evola concluded that liberalism is not even a degenerate form of politics. It is an anti-politics, an anarchic form of life marked by the absence of true power in public life. And as there was no intellectual solution to its crisis of authority, Evola looked about for a revolution from above. Evola was never a committed fascist. "Fascism is not enough," he wrote, adding that he hoped for a movement more radical, more intrepid, a fascism that is truly absolute. His courtroom claim that he had been targeted by supporters of Mussolini's regime was truthful. His criticisms of its tactics and style even made it necessary to retain bodyguards. But in fascism, Evola also sensed a rare opening to the world of tradition. He was impressed by Mussolini's argument that the state created the nation, rather than the other way around, and his invocation of the symbol of imperial Rome. Mussolini had taken notice of Evola by the late 1920s, and it was to guide the regime that Evola authored his only major wartime book, Synthesis of the Doctrine of Race, 1941, which proposed the rectification of fascist policy by the higher perspective of tradition. Racism expressed a healthy revulsion to the regression of castes, Evola's term for the subversion of hierarchy and rank in modern societies. But its biological fetishism reflected a reductive view of human beings. Evola distinguished between three different kinds of race: body, spirit, and soul, and argued for the absolute priority of the spiritual over the biological. One's spiritual race, as he termed it, is revealed in one's intellectual attitude and outlook, with those of a higher race being innately oriented to properly spiritual concerns, making them naturally fit to command. His views built on an earlier historical work, The Myth of the Blood, 1937, and mixed ideas from Plato and Eastern religions in suggesting that individual identities are inborn, fixed, and possibly reflect a pre-mortal existence. To be born into a certain condition, as a man or a woman, in one social class and family rather than another, and with certain talents and dispositions, he argued, reflected one's destiny. Evola did not have enlightened views on race. His opinions of African Americans and Jews were reprehensible. But he did not embrace scientific racism and wrote critically of its proponents, at some cost to his public reputation. In the event, his writings exercised little influence on state policy, and he eventually concluded that Italian fascism had been a joke. In a 1964 review of the regime, he argued that its legitimate aspirations were compromised by the character of the Italian people. Evola alleged the opposite occurred in Germany, where a healthy culture, founded on duty and obedience to authority, was corrupted by a perverse ideology and a demagogic leader. Revolt had been quickly translated into German and was favorably received by groups affiliated with the conservative revolution. Evola visited Germany throughout the 1930s, giving lectures to conservative social clubs. He formed an ambivalent view of the new regime. Like Spengler, he criticized Nazi ideology from the right, lamenting its proletarian aspect and the absence of aristocratic traits in Hitler. He also questioned its views on race, writing in 1931 that a nation could not be properly founded on an ideal of ethnic purity. But in the Third Reich, Evola saw positive developments as well. He was captivated by the SS and imagined in Himmler's organization the seeds of a true ruling class, an elite order, as he named it, based on an austere code and animated by a spirituality connecting it to ancient Rome. Little is known for certain about Evola's involvement with the regime or about his visits to Eastern Europe, where he met with leaders of the Romanian Iron Guard. He published little, but his elitism seems to have raised concerns. An SS report warned that Evola was a reactionary Roman whose ultimate and secret motivation must be sought in a revolt of the old aristocracy. A real right for real men. After the war, Evola withdrew to his Rome apartment, where, supported by a military pension and a wealthy benefactor, he committed himself to preserving the principles of what he called the real right. He mourned the destructiveness of the conflict, but declared himself innocent of complicity with its atrocities, claiming he had never known of them. The tragedy of European fascism, he maintained, was that it imitated the ideologies to which it was allegedly opposed. It claimed legitimacy through popular support and sought unity through common identity. He drew the striking conclusion, fatal to any remaining public respectability, that fascism was not a moral catastrophe for the illiberal right. The real right had not failed. It had never been tried. In his 1953 book, Man Among the Ruins, Evola outlined a political program for creating a post-liberal right. Its strategy guided his post-war writing and exercised an extensive influence on the European radical right. Evola's stature began to rise again, and he attracted younger readers. He set to attacking mainstream conservative parties, charging that Western nations lacked genuine right-wing movements and featured parties of the left exclusively. Today, there is very little that deserves to be preserved, he argued, and parties of the so-called right are largely to blame. They offer no resistance to liberal ideals, supporting capitalism and bourgeois morality as bulwarks of individual liberty. For Evola, everything depended on recognizing the fundamental agreement between liberalism, socialism, and communism. Each celebrated human liberation from traditional constraints, disagreeing only about the best means of achieving it. His views became darker as he argued that Americanism and communism were two tongs of the same pincers, since they pointed to the same standardizing and leveling outcomes. Evola's hope lay in the restoration of a real right. A real right is not an ideological movement, he explained, and it advances no partisan agenda. It defends a view of life based on higher principles that transcend the economic plane entirely. Evola drew revealing comparisons with the French and Communist revolutions, which were also inspired by precise doctrinal formulations. But unlike modern ideologies, Evola held a real right defends spiritual principles that are timeless, unchanging, absolute, and meta-historical. At the center of its majestic affirmations is a defense of the sacrality of temporal authority. All ordered societies require institutions that provide absolute form amid their changing material features, and it is the purpose of a real right to defend the authorities, classes, and customs by which human life is drawn upward. Evola did not provide a detailed picture of this post-liberal order, which seemed to combine elements of sacred kingship and imperial Rome, but rejected, he insisted, both totalitarianism and populist dictatorship. What was paramount was the principle that only a transformative leader could elevate humanity out of its degraded state. Such a leader could not appeal directly to the masses. That was the vulgar mistake of fascism, but must inspire submission through a lofty contempt for democratic norms and popular tastes. The presence of superior individuals bestows on a multitude a meaning and a justification they previously lacked. But Evola's movement had practical aims as well, and here his strategy became worrisome to authorities and appealing to extremists. A real right cannot be restored by democratic means. No authority can be conferred from below to above. But a small vanguard can be initiated into its intransigent truths and prepared to follow a leader who embodies them. Evola's post-war writings addressed what he called differentiated men, who felt they did not inwardly belong in liberal societies. He appealed to them as men of superior integrity, honor, courage, and virility, men who were ready for action and capable of resisting every compromise and collaboration with liberalism. Evola did not envision a political party, but something more like a fraternal order that functioned as network for metapolitical organization. Publishing houses, social clubs, and cultural foundations, he speculated, could somehow connect Europe's remaining aristocratic families with dispossessed members of the working class. Such a group would not make a long march through Western institutions. Evola dreamed that it might seize power during a democratic crisis, instituting a new order from above. Evola's fantasies revealed something fundamental to his thought that he worked to keep obscure. From Plato to the scholastics, philosophers in the West agreed that social hierarchies ought to reflect natural inequalities between human beings. While Evola aligned himself with this tradition, his views departed from it significantly. His appeal to the doctrine of two natures did not reflect a belief in a higher metaphysical order of reality. Despite his criticisms of modern science, he accepted a cosmology that left no place for the supernatural. Evola's doctrine instead reflected a belief in two kinds of human beings, whose natures embodied fundamentally different modes of reality. Masters are those who grasp the fact that human beings must give shape and structure to life through the imposition of form. Those Aristotle called slaves do not grasp the nature of these higher principles, depending on the benevolent coercion of their superiors to give form to the chaos around and within them. Evola flattered himself that he and his students were distinguished by their knowledge of human differences, and hence by their exceptional capacities. They were those meant to rule, not meant to obey. In 1961, Evola published his last major work, Ride the Tiger, a book that addressed the emerging counterculture of the decade. He admitted the failure of his earlier political strategies, acknowledging the seemingly insuperable obstacles to mobilizing a traditional right in Europe or North America. He counseled the practice of apoliteia, a path of disengagement by which one could survive the dangers of liberalism without actively fleeing from them. For the first time, Evola engaged respectfully with the intellectuals on the left, including Sartre, Camus, and writers of the Beat movement. He warned his army of differentiated men not to confuse their own radicalism with growing protests against bourgeois decadence. But the alienated students of the 1960s, he also wrote, were open to revolutionary perspectives, and tradition might offer answers to the questions posed by existentialism, Freudianism, and even Marxism. Evola's thoughts grew apocalyptic, and he began to wonder if the decline of liberal society should be actively accelerated rather than simply withstood. Since modern political institutions lack any higher legitimacy, he hinted, it might be better to contribute to the fall of that which is already wavering. Evola never explicitly called for violence in writing, but he signaled that the constraints of conventional morality were artificial and did not apply to the followers of tradition. He contemplated the possibility of taking the left-hand path, an idea that he discovered in his early studies of Tantrism, but now put to ideological uses. Its original meaning referred to the careful use of normally forbidden things with a view to achieving a mystical experience, e.g., drugs and sex. Evola proposed that the left-hand path might now include destructive and even criminal activity, when undertaken by those with a mature spiritual orientation. If the modern world represents the negation of tradition, the negation of the negation could prove to be the formative action that opens space for the return of tradition. Evola left it to his readers and the small groups of students he hosted in his home to draw the explosive conclusions. The Christian Schism. Evola anticipated the question whether a revived Christianity might foster a more traditional society and greater reverence for authority. He consistently denied that it could, offering arguments that shaped his intellectual legacy. Although avowedly spiritual, Evola was both a non-believer and openly hostile to Christianity, claiming to have rejected it in early youth after reading Russian literature. His first political book, Pagan Imperialism, 1928, identified Christianity as an alien element in European culture, earning the censure of a future pope, Giovanni Battista Montini, in a Vatican newspaper. Evola later expressed embarrassment over its inflammatory style, but never retracted the substance of its criticisms, which recur throughout his work. The greatest miracle of Christianity, he stated in a 1967 interview, was succeeding in asserting itself among European peoples. Against pressure from religious traditionalists, Evola maintained that Christianity and tradition are fundamentally irreconcilable. Christianity endangers the highest form of human wisdom, which depends on exceptional efforts at self-transformation. The Christian claim that wisdom is a gift from God, not the attainment of a superhuman elite, undercuts spiritual striving. It encourages dependency rather than ambition, gratitude rather than assurance, and passivity rather than daring. Christianity slanders as Luciferian all the Faustian virtues required to achieve true self-mastery. Evola's spiritual interests varied widely over his career, but his lifelong interest in Christianity seemed to reflect a genuine quest for enlightenment. His 1963 autobiography included the fascinating report that during the 1930s he visited Catholic religious orders, spending time living with Benedictines, Carthusians, Cistercians, and Carmelites in search of an underground esoteric tradition in Christian monasticism. He was disappointed to find no secret teaching, he writes, only moralistic Catholic doctrine. Evola's deeper criticism was that Christianity is a solvent to political authority. Society needs to be governed by a spiritual authority, just as a human being must be governed by its soul. It is the error of liberalism to organize society around the needs of the body instead. But Evola denied that Christianity could provide this. Its cardinal heresy was that it divided spiritual and temporal power, clearly separating priestly and civil offices. For Evola, there was no more insidious idea in human history, and he traced virtually all the secularizing tendencies in liberal culture to Christianity's fateful separation of spiritual and temporal authority. In dividing what belongs in perfect unity, it induces social schizophrenia, where no one authority possesses power over all human life. Evola insisted on the anomalous character of the Christian schism from tradition, alleging that ancient Egyptian, Roman, Assyrian, Persian, and Hindu societies, indeed seemingly every traditional society, united kingship and priesthood into a single office. He acknowledged that Christian history featured eras of close cooperation between church and state, and he wrote wistfully of failed medieval attempts to absorb the church into imperial authority. The war between Ghibellines and Guelphs, as he called it, was the most momentous intellectual battle in Western history, pitting defenders of imperial supremacy against defenders of ecclesial liberty. Evola understood that as a Ghibelline he had lost, and the Church had retained its institutional autonomy. Christianity is therefore the unhealed wound at the heart of Western culture. As a religion open to all people, regardless of status or background, it eroded the hieratic foundations of social order. Worse, it prevented the state from claiming sacral authority, and a state without absolute spiritual sovereignty, Evola argued, is no state at all. At the root of the Christian schism is its belief in a transcendent God. Its dualistic mythology, Evola charged, simultaneously makes human beings too servile before God and too rebellious before human authorities. And this was something Christianity inherited largely from Judaism. Evola professed not to be an anti-Semite, merely a spiritual enemy of biblical monotheism. Yet he undeniably contributed to it, writing an introduction to a 1937 edition of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, where he claimed that the forgery should not be ignored or dismissed. For Evola, the Protocols were literally false, but figuratively true. There was no Jewish cabal directing world events, but there was an occult war between tradition and its powerful if hidden enemies. Evola warned of cultural Bolshevism, the ideological discrediting of authority, of tradition, of race, or of fatherland, and he left little doubt that its root is the biblical teaching of human equality. It was the ongoing tragedy of Western history that Christianity did more than universalize Jewish values among the Gentiles. It built social structures, both secular and religious, that prevented the return of tradition. Violence and Utopia. At the time of his death in 1974, Evola was the most influential intellectual on the European radical right. In Italy, he was associated with Ordine Nuovo and Avanguardia Nazionale, extra-parliamentary groups who sought a radical confrontation with the Italian state. Their use of Evola's texts in magazines, manuals, and training sessions was well known, and Evola praised them for their fidelity to illiberal principles, despite their ties to neo-Nazi parties. Some of their members would be convicted of bombings and involvement in a series of failed coups in the 1960s and 1970s. As he had done in a courtroom decades earlier, Evola again denied moral complicity, arguing that his teachings were not even his own, since they had a primordial origin, beyond individual human discovery. But from his apartment on the Corso Vittorio Emanuele II, he continued to mentor new disciples. He was our Marcuse, only better, one student recalled. In recent decades, Evola has continued to attract new readers, first in France, where translations of his writings promoted a revival in paganism, and later in Russia, Eastern Europe, and most recently, the United States, where radicals find a bracing attack on the legitimacy of liberal elites. They find in Evola a remarkable imaginative capacity to think about the world from beyond the boundaries liberalism has assigned it. What human life has been, is, might be, and should be, Evola offered the most comprehensive expression of anti-democratic, anti-liberal, anti-egalitarian, and anti-Christian principles in the 20th century. To read him is to journey through a fantastic world of mythology, esotericism, mysticism, and pseudo-ethnology. But his thought, for all its eccentricity, also reflected the intellectual traditions he detested most. In dreaming of building the ideal state and constructing a new man, he echoed the perennial utopian theme. Once upon a time, there was a perfect state, until a moral catastrophe destroyed it. Evola imagined that such a state once existed and would exist again when the wheel of history returned to the world of tradition. Yet the world he imagined broke with the utopian tradition in Western thought and literature as well. Evola did not dream of a perfected state in which human life would be free from insecurity, violence, greed, misery, competition, and want. He did not hope to end pain and danger, to unite men in bonds of love, or to reconcile freedom and equality. Evola's fantasy was not of the mighty laid low and the humble raised up. It offered something more beguiling and arguably more necessary to those who, like him, experience modernity as a time of spiritual dispossession and who fear irrelevance more than exploitation. Evola dreamed of a world of absolutely fixed and certain meanings, where human identities, in all their forms, bore the indelible chrism of sacred destiny. He fantasized about a world saturated with meanings so thick, so absolute, and so unchallengeable that they could create reflections of eternity in time. Evola did not live in hopeful anticipation of a better world after this one. The dream of heaven he called a hallucination. He wished for a world after liberalism where holiness was again experienced in the otherwise cruel necessities of today. Both Christianity and liberalism teach us to see such necessities as things to be reformed and in need of redemption. But for those who prefer to see them as charged with the highest spiritual meaning, Evola's dream can tell them why.